Welcome to this virtual overview of open government. In this video, we will explore the definition of e-government and open government, review an open government timeline. In particular, I will highlight key legislation and regulations. And finally, we'll discuss some of the opportunities and challenges associated with open government. For instance, what are the implications for citizen privacy, trust, and engagement? The purpose of this video is to provide a high-level overview of key concepts. This video is not designed to take a stance on open government or posit whether it is right or wrong. Instead, in this video, we will explore diverse terms, viewpoints, and initiatives related to open government, or OpenGov for short. While OpenGov is an international phenomenon, this video will focus on OpenGov advancements in the United States. So, let's get started. Before exploring definitions, I have a few questions for you. Should government be open? Should it be transparent? What do you think? There are multiple schools of thought. One can be summarized by a quote by a former political science professor who says, "Nothing could be more axiomatic or self-evident and obvious for a democracy than the principle of exposing the process of government to relentless public criticism and scrutiny." Or as President Harry Truman stated, secrecy and a free democratic government don't mix. The other viewpoint is summarized by Bach, an American philosopher and ethicist, who says, "While all deception requires secrecy, all secrecy is not meant to deceive." Keep these opposing views in mind as we discuss open government. Which do you agree with? Do you see value in them both? We will come back to this discussion towards the end of the video when we explore the transparency paradox. Before we tackle open government, let's make sure we all know what electronic government or e-government is. E-government is the use of information technology, or IT, to support government operations, engage citizens, and provide government services. Now that we have a founding definition of e-government, let's move on to discussing open government. As we discuss open government, be mindful that a nation's approach and view of OpenGov ebbs and flows as elected officials change. For instance, on his first full day in office, President Obama issued a memorandum on transparency and open government, calling on his administration to develop recommendations that would establish a system of transparency, public participation, and collaboration. These recommendations were used to create an open government directive, which instructs agencies to transform themselves and become more transparent, collaborative, and participatory. Now, this premise did not originate with President Obama and his aides, or even the numerous organizations and individuals who advised them. These beliefs have a basis in existing law and regulation. The notion of open government can be traced back to legislation in the 18th century with the passage of the Freedom of the Press Act in Sweden in 1776. As I mentioned, this video will focus on the United States. In the U.S., the 1966 Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA, establishes the public's right to obtain information from federal government agencies. Through this act, every citizen of the United States gained the right to access and obtain reproductions of records created and maintained by federal government agencies. The act was originally created to ensure an informed citizenry and to hold the governors accountable to the governed. Prior to its passage, public access to records of federal agencies was governed by Section 3 of the Administrative Procedure Act, which had been interpreted as giving agencies unlimited discretion to withhold such records. Efforts to amend this system began as early as 1955, but were not successful until 1966. FOIA establishes a presumption that these records are accessible to the people. With the passage of FOIA, the burden of proof shifted from the individual to the government. Those seeking information are no longer required to show a need for information. Instead, the need-to-know standard has been replaced by a right-to-know doctrine. The government now has to justify the need for secrecy. The Freedom of Information Act was amended in 1996. This amendment is frequently referred to as e-FOIA since it allows for greater access to electronic information. The congressional finding that accompanied the 1996 amendments noted that FOIA has led to disclosures of waste, fraud, and abuse in the federal government, and to the identification of unsafe consumer products, harmful drugs, and serious health hazards. Not all information is available to citizens via FOIA. There are non-exemptions. For instance, there's an exemption that applies to information that is classified to protect national security. There's another exemption that protects geological information on wells. The 1996 amendment did not change the exemptions. In 2007, for the first time in over a decade, Congress enacted amendments to the Freedom of Information Act with the Open Government Act. The act was followed shortly by the Open Government Directive, which we've already mentioned, from 2009. Despite these acts and directives, progress has been incremental. For instance, even after President George W. Bush signed a presidential executive order to speed up processing times, backlogs only fell by 2%. Recently, the Foia Improvement Act of 2016 was passed. It includes provisions for the public inspection of several documents in electronic format. As I mentioned earlier, government transparency is a complex concept, and it cannot be discussed in the absence of its antithesis, government secrecy, which brings us to the transparency paradox. Think back to the opening questions. Should the government be transparent? Is secrecy acceptable? If so, when and where should the line be drawn? According to some researchers, there are three forms of government secrecy: genuine national security secrecy, bureaucratic secrecy, and political secrecy. Genuine secrecy involves legitimately withholding information that would compromise national security if released, such as information on military strategies or even trade secrets. The second type, bureaucratic secrecy, occurs when government agencies arbitrarily withhold information on the rationale that non-disclosure poses less risk than disclosure. Or due to bureaucratic politics, individual government agencies might withhold information because of a rivalry. Other examples would be the unnecessary classification of government records or the redaction of released material. Finally, political secrecy refers to the willful withholding or manipulation of government records via classification to either achieve a hidden political agenda or to conceal one. Agencies can also engage in political secrecy by selectively disseminating records to sustain a particular narrative or maintain control over an issue. Now, nations have diverse outlooks on the appropriate balance of secrecy and transparency. Recently, cities have turned to public input to shape open data policy. For instance, Tempe, Arizona is collecting public feedback through a Google Doc on its open data policy and open data portal. Nashville, Tennessee is using a platform called Madison, designed by the OpenGov Foundation to host public comments on drafts of policies and legislation. In addition to Madison and Google Docs, cities have also used GitHub to collect feedback. Transparency advocates hope technology-based collaborations will become a permanent part of the lawmaking process. In conclusion, I want to leave you with a quote from the 14th Prime Minister of India. He said, "While transparency reduces corruption, good governance goes beyond transparency in achieving openness. Openness means involving the stakeholders in the decision-making process. Transparency is the right to inform, while openness is the right to participation." Now that we have come to the conclusion of this video, it is time to apply what you have learned. Access your open data and FOIA assignments. As you read the instructions, consider what I've outlined in this video. As you work on your assignments, remember, you can always access this video again to refresh your memory.